there, interwebs, I hope you're doing well, and I know I said that my plan was to do only 2 videos a month going forward, and that is still the plan, but I wanted to post up another quick video as a follow-up to my first video about Dave Chapelle's special, The Closer, because since then, since I posted that video, there's been a lot of fallout from the special that I think is just as important to discuss as the special itself at this point, such as the very vocal backlash from the trans community towards Chappelle's special, the walkout by Netflix employees, Chappelle's supposed canceling, as well as Chappelle's, let's say, interesting response to all of this. We'll leave it there, we'll get to it. As well as I wanted to discuss a few other things that I didn't really touch upon in my original video, namely and specifically around Chappelle's transgender friend, Daphne, who killed herself after online harassment, something that Chappelle discussed within his special, but I didn't really touch upon much in my initial video. So to be very clear, this video right here, the one that you're watching right now, is going to be mainly focused on the backlash and discourse that has come out after Chappelle's special, and if you want my thoughts on the special itself and how I think Chappelle actually had some really salient things to say about race and the LGBTQ community within that, but how, while I don't think he was being actively malicious or hateful, I do feel his special perpetuated a few misconceptions and harm towards trans people when he discussed trans people within it. All that's in my initial video that should be up here, I believe, on this side of the screen, I hope. So check that out if you want my thoughts on the special itself. But this one, as I said, is going to be more focused on the reaction. And also, I think it's really important to reiterate here that my goal with all of my videos is never to hate on someone, to cancel someone. That's, I'm not directing anger towards Chappelle in this video. In fact, I honestly find that anger isn't really an emotion that really motivates me to write or create things. My goal with this video, as it is with all of my videos, is just to explain the situation, give you all the facts as I can find them and as I see them, and then provide you with my own analysis of the situation and my own point of view on the situation that will be colored by my opinion, but also allow you the space to have a discussion with me and to form your own opinion. That's the goal, and so why I'm going to be critical of Chappelle as well as trans people in this video. I'm going to be critical of the response to Chappelle as well. I do want you to know that the goal of this is not to hate on Chappelle. Okay? Just to lay that out up front. With all of that said, let's get into it and go over a quick timeline of what has happened since the special has been released. After the special was released on Netflix, there were a whole host of responses, mainly with many folks, like myself, who took issue with how Chappelle spoke about trans issues within the special, especially considering that pretty much the entirety of the special was devoted to discussing trans folks. If you haven't watched the special, pretty much the bulk of it is discussing trans people within it.
Gay people get mad at me, lesbians get mad at me, but I'm gonna tell you right now, and this is true, these transgenders, these want me dead.
Now, this got a lot of play in the news cycle with everyone from MSNBC to Fox News talking about it, and the most prominent people who were platformed as criticizing the special and were focused on as criticizing the special were several transgender Netflix employees, including a showrunner for Dear White People who went on to quit Netflix as a protest of the special, and Tara Field, a transgender head software engineer at Netflix. A few days after this, though, Tara and 2 other employees were even briefly suspended from Netflix after they attended a directors-level meeting about the special that they weren't invited to. However, both Tara and the other 2 employees were quickly reinstated after that fact because, number 1, there was a huge public backlash to her being suspended, and number 2, it turns out that she actually asked to attend the meeting in her company's Slack channel, was given the meeting link, and no one told her not to attend. So, at the very least, there was some miscommunication there about whether or not she should have been in the meeting, and that was not on Tara and the other 2 employees themselves. And to their credit, Netflix did take ownership of that and did at least say that, but it is still kind of crappy that 3 employees got suspended for a few days and had all this public backlash focused on them. Now, after all of this backlash, Netflix's CEO sent an email to all of the employees at Netflix, and that email was eventually leaked to the press, and in that email he said, quote, "While some employees disagree, we have a strong belief that content on screen doesn't directly translate to real-world harm. The strongest evidence to support this is that violence on screens has grown hugely over the last 30 years, especially with first-party shooter games, and yet violent crime has fallen significantly in many countries. Adults can watch violence, assault, and abuse, or even shocking stand-up comedy without it causing them to harm others." This comment itself received a lot of backlash as well because Well, honestly, it's just kind of silly. Yes, I do agree with his point that depicting violence and things like that doesn't always translate into real world violence. That's often a misconception that we've been fighting against for years. But there is also direct evidence that depictions of things like transphobia or harm or stereotypes of trans people does enforce real stereotypes that do have a real effect on real people, especially in the trans community. There's a distinct difference between depicting over-the-top spectacle violence and depicting things that are actual real stereotypes in the real world against trans people that have been existing for several decades to hundreds of years at this point, and reinforcing those stereotypes that already exist within our society. Even beyond that, though, we've even seen that media does have effect elsewhere, as we saw with shows like Netflix's own 13 Reasons Why, when it glamorized suicide in one of its initial first seasons, showcasing a girl that slit her wrists, and there being a lot of discussions about how that actually leads to many people actually acting out suicide. Not only that, but Netflix is one of the first companies, along with basically every single media company right now, that is so ready and happy to pat themselves on the back about how much of a difference they're making in the world when they bother to release any media that actually represents underprivileged groups. Like when they release shows like The Queer Eye, they would always constantly talk about, like, look how much of a difference this show Queer Eye is making in the world. So you can't have it both ways. You can't say, oh, this media makes a difference and something like The Closer doesn't. And even Netflix's CEO seemed to realize this mistake a few days later because he said, quote, "Of course storytelling has real impact in the real world. I reiterate that because it's why I work here. It's why we do what we do. That impact can be hugely positive and it can be quite negative." Now, he didn't go so far as to say that he believes The Closer is causing actual harm, but I guess he's at least acknowledging that media can have effects, which is, I guess, a starting place. And don't worry, we're going to be talking about the direct effects of Chappelle's special in just a little bit. Not to mention the fact that, everything that's currently happening and all the stuff that we're talking about in this video is a direct effect of the media, The Closer special. So, kind of proves the point there, doesn't it? Anyways, after this, Netflix workers organized a walkout on the company, along with publishing a list of tasks and asks that they wish the company to pursue as a result of all of this backlash, which we'll be talking about in a little bit later. We'll be talking about that specific list in just a moment. However, before the walkout actually happened, one of the organizers of the walkout was fired from the company, with Netflix claiming that they were fired because they supposedly leaked metrics of the special to Bloomberg, which is something that Netflix never does. They never release metrics to the public about their specific, data points around certain specials and how well shows are doing. However, if you look at some of the reports about this firing, you'll find that actually Netflix only fired them on the suspicion that they released it to the public, at least as far as I could find. And correct me if I'm wrong, I may be wrong on that, but most of the reports that I could find confirm that the employee did actively share the metrics within the company, but there's no proof that they shared it with outside the company, and even the employee themselves actively spoke out against sharing the metrics externally, thinking that it would be a bad idea. Now, that could have just been face-saving, but there's no exact proof that we know of. So, and it's also kind of crappy to fire someone before you have definitive evidence of that. But again, I might be wrong on that. There might be a report that I missed in my research. So we ultimately don't know. Maybe they did actually share the company documents, which, while I'm personally cool with that because I would like that information, I could also see why that would lead to them being fired. Even in that case, this doesn't make Netflix look great to fire the person who's running the walkout days before the walkout when you're receiving backlash. So the walkout eventually happened. It lasted one day, and the next day the Netflix employees went back to work. And as of right now, Netflix has not enacted any public-facing changes due to the walkout. They may be discussing it internally, but as we see right now, there's been no public announcement around any possible changes because of the walkout or the reaction to the special. Moving on, though, let's talk about Dave Chapelle, because Dave Chapelle, after all of this stuff, has gone on record claiming that he has been canceled, even joking, saying that if this is what canceled is, then I love it. However, despite the claims of being canceled, he's been also selling sold-out comedy shows even after the backlash has happened, and he is proceeding with releasing his upcoming documentary film in several film festivals. Though, to be fair, some film festivals have canceled the documentary's premiere at them, so he may have to sit out a few film festivals, but ultimately that's really the only major, negative consequence that we've seen him face, at least demonstrably, from this backlash. Finally, on top of all of that, Chappelle released his own response to the walkout, stating this.
To the transgender community, I am more than willing to give you an audience, but you will not summon me. I am not bending to anybody's demands. And if you want to meet with me, I'd be more than willing to, but I have some conditions. First of all, you cannot come if you have not watched my special from beginning to end. You must come to a place of my choosing and a time of my choosing. And thirdly, you must admit that Hannah Gadsby is not funny.
Okay, so that's basically the timeline of events that have happened since the special was released. And now I want to get more into my personal analysis of all of this news. And I want to first focus on how Dave Chapelle framed his response to the transgender community in that clip that you just watched. First off, most importantly, no one is summoning him. I mean, there's no poor trans woman sitting in her apartment alone with a candle looking into a mirror saying his name 5 times in order to bring his spirit forth. Sadly, we can't do that type of spell because it requires menstrual blood. My terrible jokes aside, the tone of Dave Chappelle's response in that clip that I showed you, overall, I felt that it felt very adversarial towards the trans community. Maybe you'll disagree, but his whole summoning line makes it come across as if trans people are the ones trying to force him to the table, or trying to drag him over to try and force him to have us yell at him all of our thoughts and opinions at him. And that he's the one that ultimately wants to have the conversation. Yet, he's also the one making demands before he even begins to consider listening to a conversation that he himself started by making his special all about trans people. And that, to me, seems to be missing the entire point of a conversation. Now, to be fair, in his demands video, Chappelle did say this.
For the record, and I need you to know this, everyone I know from that community has been nothing but loving and supporting. So I don't know what all this nonsense is about.
But you don't get to say that in your video, that it's not us versus them, and then 2 minutes later, list your demands to the transgender community and then say this.
To the transgender community, I am more than willing to give you an audience, but you will not summon me. I am not bending to anybody's demands.
Even further, it feels like Dave Chapelle is using this canceling narrative to try and sell his new documentary, going so far as to say this.
I desperately want people to see this movie, but I understand why investors would be nervous. Since nobody will touch it, I'll tell you what I'll do. I will make it available for all of you in 10 American cities, going on sale in the next few days. You will be able to see this movie in its entirety, and you can see what they're trying to obstruct you from seeing. And you can judge for yourself, but you cannot have this conversation and exclude my voice from it.
Like, the reason for this controversy isn't your documentary, Chappelle, yet he's framing that as the next thing that they are going to cancel. So you need to go out and see it because they want to take it away from you and come and attend and buy my tickets in those cities. So really, whose interests and whose financial interests are the ones being furthered here? Because it certainly isn't trans people's. So in reality, all of this kind of comes across to me like he's not speaking to trans people here, both in his special or in this response to the backlash. What it feels more like is he's doing this performance conversation in order to actually have a conversation with folks outside of the trans community who are watching all of this from the sidelines about how he feels attacked and victimized by the trans community, which in the special he painted as only mainly white trans folks and often ignored that black trans folks actually existed. And so in many ways, this doesn't come across as him like actually trying to talk to the trans community. It comes across as him trying to frame this entire backlash and supposed conversation in an adversarial way, like it's the trans community versus him. And even further, he keeps leaning into this, canceling narrative that's been going on around him, even yelling to his fans after a special,
You have to answer the question, am I canceled or not? Then let's go. Thank you very much and good night.
Is he canceled? because I don't think he's really canceled. Maybe you'll disagree with me, but as I said, all of his specials are still up on Netflix. He's still doing sellout shows. He's still performing comedy right now. He's being defended by the CEO of one of the world's biggest streaming services, and he's making money on all of that. And he also has a documentary coming out in just a few short weeks. So he's clearly, to me, it doesn't feel like he's being canceled. In fact, it very much feels like he's whatever the opposite of canceled is, renewed. He's renewed. Dave Chappelle's been renewed, I guess would be the phrase. In fact, even more so, his response to me proves that he's the one with the most power here. The very fact that he is dictating terms speaks to the fact that, at least to my mind, that he's the one with the huge platform, that he doesn't need to have this conversation if he doesn't want to, despite the fact that he's the one that started the conversation in the first place by having the whole special be about trans folks. He didn't have to do that. He could have done his special on any other conversation or topic. So he was the one that forced trans people to have this conversation, and yet he gets to take the money and walk away if he so chooses. Also, one of the terms that he dictated was that the trans community has to admit that Hannah Gadsby isn't funny, which I think is meant to be just a joke term that he's just tossing in there to make people in the crowd laugh, but really comes across in very bad taste, considering that Hannah Gadsby has also been very vocal about her criticism of Chappelle's special, as well as the fact that she has faced a ton of backlash from folks calling her not funny before after her deeply personal stand-up special in the net, where she openly talked about her own sexual assault in a, to my mind, extremely funny yet very powerful way. So for him calling out Hannah Gadsby in this way feels like, again, he's not speaking to trans people, but he's speaking to the same folks who piled on Hannah Gadsby herself, intentionally or not, inciting a renewal of that harassment that she initially faced, and also speaks to the undercurrent of misogyny that female comedians often face with them being seen as, quote, not funny, when often they are extremely funny, as well as the fact that her special was very relatable to victims of misogyny, harassment, and sexual assault, of which often trans people disproportionately are. So asking us to say that she's not funny not only leans on misogyny, but asks us to denounce someone who many of us can relate to and who is clearly an ally of the trans community, which is just a crappy thing to say that we have to do in order to have a conversation with you, to denounce someone who is an ally to us. What a crappy thing, even if it was a joke. And even if we go beyond that, if we actually look at what most trans people are saying about Dave Chappelle, at least the most prominent ones, they aren't calling for him to be canceled at all. While I'm sure there are many people on Twitter and the internet that possibly many of you have seen that are calling for him to be canceled and we hate Dave Chappelle and he should just go away and never talk again and we all hate him, if you actually look at what most people are saying in terms of the actual, discourse and conversation around the special, a lot of trans people are just asking to have an honest conversation. Most of us understand that while we take issue with what Chappelle said in his special, we don't think he's an active hateful bigot. One can make something that is harmful, that is, people take issue with and is painful to a marginalized community without being an actively hateful person. And by the way, this is why I always try to discuss actions as transphobic, not people. People, I don't believe, are inherently transphobic, at least most people. I feel like people can make transphobic actions. Even myself, I have done transphobic actions. I've misgendered people on accident. That's a transphobic thing. And I'm a trans person. So I feel like actions can be transphobic, and we can talk about the level of harm that those transphobic actions can take and the intention with which those people made those actions, whether they intended to be transphobic or not. But I don't think people are always inherently transphobic, and I don't think Dave Chappelle is inherently a transphobic bigot. And I think most people understand that. I mean, if you look at Jacelyn Moore, who was the trans woman showrunner of Dear White People who initially quit Netflix, in an interview she stated, "I don't think it's my place to tell Dave Chapelle what he needs to do. He should make the jokes that he wants to make. I cannot like them, and that's what I'm saying here. I don't think pulling the special is the answer. I don't think that's a reasonable outcome here. What I really want is I want companies to hire trans people to work there who can say, hey, we sure about this? The fact of the matter is there are very rarely trans people in those rooms, and yet we are so often the subject of the derision. We're very rarely in any decision-making positions, and I think that's my bigger concern." Even if we go beyond her, as I mentioned before, the Netflix workers, when they did their walkout, had a list of asks. I've been trying to say that like 5 times. I've reshot this like 5 times. I could not say list of asks. I don't know why I phrased it in my script that way. Anyways, the Netflix workers had a list of asks that they had for Netflix around the closer and around what they hope to have happen after their walkout. And if you look at them, not one of them is to remove the closer from Netflix. In fact, the list is mostly just asking for more trans people to be hired, both on camera and behind it, especially when it comes to trans-focused content. So as we can see, the most prominent voices in this discussion around Dave Chapelle aren't calling for Dave Chapelle to be canceled. In fact, most people, like Moore, myself, the Netflix worker walkouts, and a lot of trans folks, just want trans people, especially trans people of color, to be in the room, to be part of the conversation from the beginning, especially when the topic or media or things being created at hand are about us. As they say, there should be nothing about us without us. This isn't saying that only trans people can talk about trans issues. It's saying that trans people should be included in the conversation about ourselves at some point, anywhere, at all. You know, just people just talking about trans people and saying, I don't want to have the conversation at all with trans people. You don't see how that comes across as, at the very least, just rude? Now, it should be known that Dave Chapelle did say something about this when he said this.
Do not blame the LGBTQ community for any of this shit. This has nothing to do with them. It's about corporate interests and what I can say and what I cannot say.
Now, to a degree, he is right. This is about corporate interests, but he's also leaning onto this idea of it's free speech. It's a free speech argument, I say with air quotes, which is, again, a common thing that people frame things around when we talk about canceling somebody, which, again, I don't think he is being canceled. Again, it's not about telling Chapelle what he can or can't do. It's about us being there to talk about it from the start when people are talking about us. That's literally all we're asking for. Because quite often, trans people just don't get included at all, ever, at any point. We've seen this in the long history of media about trans people, whether the media has been good or bad. There have been tons of great works of art that have been made about trans people that never actually included trans people prominently in the work being created. I think of like a ton of these actors who have gotten Oscars and Emmy nominations and wins for portraying trans people when there was no prominent trans crew member or, actor on screen at all within the film. Even further, going back to the special, if anyone is getting canceled, it's trans folks, considering that several trans folks have lost their jobs, either temporarily or permanently, and more, as I'll talk about in just a few moments. And going back to Chapelle, while this idea of him being canceled and this us versus them narrative paints Chapelle as the victim, to my mind, it actually does the opposite. It actually protects him. Because what it does is it actively shuts down conversations. When you say you're canceled, what you're doing is telling the people who still support you, of which Chapelle still has many supporters, that they don't need to listen to trans people because we're being ridiculous. We just want to cancel him. We just want to hate him. Saying you're canceled is safe because it insulates him. It's safer because it means that folks feel justified not listening to criticism of him, even if the criticism is valid and it's coming from a place of trying to be constructive and open, not hateful. And in that space, misinformation about the trans community spreads because people only listen to what other people are saying about us, not trans people ourselves, instead of actually listening to what we are saying. It allows people to get angry about trans people without listening to trans people because we're being told that we're being awful or over the top or oversensitive. But most importantly, this frames anger towards trans people as justified. Because trans people are framed as attacking, over the top, insensitive, trying to just cancel Chapelle, it frames us as the aggressors. And thereby, if you're angry at us, if you're mad at us as a result of this, which you should be if we were trying to cancel and hurt Chapelle, it makes that feel justified to his supporters. And by the way, this is something that Chapelle himself leaned into within his own special when he talked about Daphne's story, the story of his trans friend who ultimately killed herself. For those of you who haven't seen it, in the special, he basically ends the entire performance with the story of his friend Daphne, who was a trans woman comedian who he was friends with, who, when he got a lot of backlash for his trans jokes in his last special, she came out in support of him. She said something on Twitter online that supported him. And as a result of that, she got a lot of harassment and backlash. And then, to hear him tell it within the special, a few days later, she ultimately killed herself. With him sort of kind of implying that her death was a direct result of this harassment.
Beautiful friend. It took a lot of heart to defend me like that. And when she did that, the trans community dragged that
all over Twitter. For days, they was going in on her, and she was holding her own because she's funny. But 6 days after that wonderful night I described to you, my friend Daphne killed herself. Oh, yeah. It's a true story. My heart was broken.
I didn't really discuss Daphne's story in my initial video on Chappelle and the special because while the special is truly horrific and, to be honest, quite powerful in its utilization within the special, it ultimately felt superfluous to his larger point and story. Her story wasn't really part of the argument that he was making, it was more ancillary to the points that he was trying to make. And by the way, make no mistake, his special, like most good comedy specials done by smart comedians like Dave Chapelle who are commenting on social issues, they're not just superfluous jokes, but arguments wrapped in comedy. Many good comedy specials are just as much a video essay as this one that you're watching here on YouTube right now. And that's not a good or bad thing, it's part of the art form of stand-up comedy. It's why I like stand-up comedy, when comedians use their platform to actually make an argument, even though it's wrapped up in comedy. Comedy can be used to make salient points, as Chappelle was doing in his special, clearly, considering that there's so much to talk about with it. If it was just superfluous jokes, no one would care. But he actually has a point in his statement to make. And Daphne's story wasn't really a part of that. And if you want to know what his argument was, again, I talked about it in my other video. However, I do feel, and I wish I had addressed this in my initial video, that Daphne's story was actually incredibly important because it was deeply integral to how he was framing the special and framing the narrative to those who were watching the special. Because the framing that whether he intended this or not, the framing that he was utilizing, and I'm not even entirely sure this was his intention, but the framing that he eventually comes across as depicting is that he is being harassed by the trans community, and that those on his side who support him, like how he frames Daphne, are the victims, and trans people are the victimizers, the ones who are abusing, the ones who are attacking, even going so far as to causing a woman to go commit suicide. That's the framing, and that's how he ends the special. That powerful story, framing trans people as these in-caring monsters, or at least the trans community as a whole as these in-caring monsters who ultimately killed a woman. Now, obviously, online harassment is awful. Believe me, I know about it. I will talk about that in a second. But it's awful regardless of if trans people did it or not. And if trans folks did harass Daphne, that's awful, and I condemn it. I condemn anyone who harasses trans people. By the way, I have also condemned in all of my other videos harassment of people who I disagree with, and even more vehemently anti-trans folks. While I do think there is a nuanced conversation about how we talk about online platforms and how people can dogpile, how people can heighten things over zealously attack people, and also send horrific harassment, it's also worth pointing out that we actually don't know if that harassment that Daphne faced led to her death. While Daphne's family has gone on record defending Chappelle, Daphne's roommate and her friend, who, by the way, for many trans folks and LGBTQ folks, our found family can often be quite closer to us than our real family. That's just a thing in the LGBTQ community. Daphne's friend and former roommate said that Daphne's suicide wasn't so clear-cut.
After Daphne died, it was crickets from Dave Chapelle for months and years after it happened. When a group of her theater comedy friends threw a memorial for her in San Francisco, DC didn't say anything. When her funeral in Pennsylvania happened a couple months later, DC's team hadn't reached out to her friends or family. When we planned another memorial for her in SF, we didn't hear anything from his team. It was like if he said something about her, he would admit that he was responsible for her death. I'm not going to say I know for sure 100% that Dave Chapelle making fun of Daphne in his 2019 special is what caused her death. I don't think it was the leading cause, but who knows? Daphne had PTSD from a life of trauma, and she had battled suicidal thoughts for years. I think the final blow was a combination of her losing custody of her daughter, losing her job, and dealing with a lot of transphobic harassment on the streets of San Francisco. I lived with her, and yet I didn't know how bad she was feeling. Now that quote is part of a much larger statement that Mia posted online, and I'll link it down below, but I'll summarize it a bit here.
And she stated also that the timeline of when Daphne posted defending Chappelle and when she ultimately committed suicide doesn't completely match up with Dave Chappelle's narrative. And finally, Daphne's roommate also said that Daphne was really excited when Dave Chapelle mentioned her in his special, the one before this one, but that she felt like she was also being kind of used by him as sort of like a shield, even before she committed suicide. Now, ultimately, at the end of the day, I don't know what the truth is here. I was not there for Chappelle and Daphne's friendship. I don't know how close it was. I was not there friends with Daphne at all, so I don't know. But what I will say is that Chappelle's side of the story isn't the only incomplete one. But what is important is how Chappelle frames Daphne's story. Because he could have framed it as a condemnation of all harassment online. He could have framed it as, this is bad, but the whole trans community isn't bad. But instead, the way he frames it comes across as like, the trans community killed my friend as a whole. The whole trans community killed my friend. And that's bad. And he doesn't add any nuance to that or any shadings of gray to that. And so to end on that note, really leans into this us versus them narrative in a way that frames trans people as not only just angry, but actively abusive. And that has very, 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 very real effects on how people defend and talk and think about this special. My initial video about Chappelle was all about trying to be kind, caring, and empathetic and have a nuanced conversation around the special. And I got so many comments with people angry at me saying, you trans people killed Daphne. I don't want to support trans people because of how out of control you people are. That story stopped people from listening to me and made people actively angry and hateful of me just by the fact that I didn't even know who Daphne was before this special and refused to listen to my actual points in my initial video because of the way that he used and framed Daphne's story. And let me be clear here. I am not saying that Daphne's harassment, especially if it was done by trans people, is okay. What I am saying is I hate this kind of weaponization of horrific stories like this because, yes, Daphne's death is horrible, and those who harassed her should be condemned, and it might have been a major contributing factor to her death. But where are the same people horrified at the treatment of Daphne when that same treatment gets targeted at all trans people? Where are they when trans people are bullied and harassed online regularly by hate groups and transphobes, as numerous studies have shown that trans people face a disproportional amount of in online spaces? There is a large disproportional amount of hatred towards trans people in online spaces, especially on YouTube, where one study found that over 40% of comments about trans people are hateful comments. But no one's angry about that. They only care about the harassment that Daphne faced because it affected Chappelle. Beyond that, there are literally entire sites and online communities that were created with the express purpose to dox, harass, insult, and coordinate attacks on trans folks online, with whole threads on websites like that dedicated to harassing and doxing and hating specific trans people. I myself, as I said, have gotten this numerous times, and I know many other trans creators get it regularly too. Video game journalist Jim Stephanie Snerling also did a recent video on it that I'll post up here, I believe. Death threats. I've literally gotten death threats numerous times over the years, just for being a trans person online and just for having a nuanced conversation, just for trying to be kind and caring as best I can. I'm not saying that the things that I talk about aren't heightened issues, but then I try to approach them from a kind way. And even I get death threats. I'm not perfect. I'm not saying I'm above criticism. I'm just saying death threats are never warranted. Even on my own initial Chappelle video, where again, I called for a kind, nuanced conversation and not to hate on Chappelle, that video garnered me waves of harassment for basically the week after that I posted my video on Chappelle, and still trickling in here to this day, and I'm assuming I'll probably get more on this video myself. I had to wade through tons of messages, comments, and emails from people telling me to kill myself, that I'm gross and disgusting, that I'm nasty looking, that I look mutilated, that I will never be a woman, which is a common phrase used by transphobes just to be hateful. I had to wade through all of that. I mean, hell, even if you believe that I'm not a woman, which, we can have that whole other conversation, I really feel like it's only jerks trying to be hurtful and cruel and mean who just go into someone's comments just to literally just say, you will never be a woman, because they know it's intentionally hurtful. They know that it's going to make me feel bad. I'm not saying I have to agree with me on that. Trans women are women, but I would rather have a conversation about that and what that means. But people are just coming in and saying, you'll never be a woman, with the express goal of just trying to be mean. That's the goal of it. That's what it is. And I got tons of that. On top of, like I said, the death threats and people telling me to go kill myself. Now, as I should say, there were also tons more thoughtful and kind comments from all of you out there on that video, and I really appreciate it, and I read all of them, and they were absolutely wonderful. And I'm really, really glad for that. But the fact that the video was targeted for harassment is important, because this is a dynamic we see with numerous prominent trans people, and also towards just trans people existing online. even without the following and platform that I have. And I have tools to help me. I have also been somewhat inured and trained to deal with this because I've dealt with it for so many years. A trans person just wanting to go online who has a Twitter account may get this, even to the same level as me, because these sites literally do it for fun, and they don't have the same tools, and that may lead them to suicidal thoughts. But there's no discussion of that nuance when we talk about Daphne. We only talk about the trans community being hateful and hurtful. I could weaponize those same stories and say everyone who supports Dave Chapelle is a horrible, horrible bigot who supports this harassment. And that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that this harassment happens to everyone online. And we need to focus on the actual conversation. We need to focus on how we stop that harassment overall and how it disproportionately gets targeted against trans people. And also hold in our hearts and minds that we can have another separate conversation about what Dave Chappelle's argument was in his initial special. Now, I should say, for me personally, I'm pretty hardened to this type of harassment nowadays. It's typically the same exact phrases and same exact things said over and over again ad nauseum. And there's only so long I can be bothered by something like that. I'm more insulted, honestly, by the lack of creativity. But this brings me back to Dave Chappelle's special, though, because the language that they use of, trans people being gross, mutilated, nasty, saying I'll always be a man, that I have broad shoulders and I'm nasty and disgusting. That language and that wording is the same wording that Chappelle used in his special to describe trans people.
I'll be looking around the crowd, searching for knuckles and Adam's apples to see where the threats might be coming from.
I'm not saying that Chappelle is being actively hateful or, angry at trans people. What I am saying is that Chappelle's language and jokes of trans people in that special mirrors active transphobic hate speech. And so it comes across to me as somewhat lazy humor that not only normalizes this type of language because, hey, big comedian Dave Chapelle used it in a comedy special supported by Netflix, so it must be fine. But then when he combines it with an us versus them narrative and Daphne's story together, it actually makes that type of language seem more justified. That there's a justification to harass or at the very least use this type of language towards trans people. A group that, as Daphne's story itself illustrates, is already disproportionately prone to online harassment leading to mental health issues and suicidal thoughts. Even further, active transphobic groups have used this backlash to Dave Chappelle's special and the fact that it is causing folks to ignore trans people's actual voices and to frame trans people as somewhat angry and awful and, over the top. They use that to instill further transphobia and spread misinformation about trans folks, framing us as aggressive and angry. For example, on Reddit, one of the largest posts about the Netflix worker walkout was claiming how violent the protesters were, with a video of this guy being attacked posted online, with many of the comments on that video being intensely transphobic. Despite the fact that if you watch the video, you can literally see that the guy was just being an asshole, walking into that protest with a sign directly opposing the protest and just screaming and yelling. And so the protesters took his sign, and even one of the protesters used her body to separate him from others so that a fight didn't break out. But that video gets posted online to frame the trans walkout people as angry and aggressive and attacking. Alt-right creators like Andy Nago, who has support of the Proud Boys, by the way, have used the event to frame trans people as angry and aggressive on his Twitter feed and in stories that he's published. Not to mention, as I already said, the online harassment groups target trans people with more online harassments if they speak up about the special, as I myself faced and saw. Now, with all of this, I will add a criticism here of the trans community in all of this, because it should be mentioned that one of the trans activists who helped organize the Netflix walkout, Ashley Marie Preston, has had some old anti-Asian tweets resurface a few days after the walkout happened. Now, a few things with this. Her tweets were horrible, pretty gross, and I think they should be very much condemned. And I in no way wish to diminish that. However, it's worth noting
that Ashley herself came out 2 years ago before this even happened about how those tweets were horrible and she regrets them and apologizes for them. At the height of my meth addiction 8-9 years ago, I made a series of racially insensitive and homophobic tweets. I wasn't out yet and was dealing with internalized transphobia while homeless in a neighborhood where I felt culturally inferior. I'd stay up for days on end, tweeting from an impaired consciousness while shadowboxing via tweet with anyone who made me feel less than. Although these tweets are resurfaced as a political play, I take full responsibility for my actions and deeply apologize for those I have offended or hurt. I also apologize to those indirectly impacted by these developments. At over 7.5 years clean and sober, I've learned to make amends when I'm wrong and to take complete accountability for my actions. I didn't have the education, information, mentorship, or cultural competence I have now. I'm also not strung out on drugs and have a clear heart and mind today. My life in recovery has been a living amends in and of itself, and I fully intend to keep fighting on the front line for the rights of all marginalized people.
The reason they were surfaced now is because it's a common tactic by right-wing groups to try to discredit an entire movement and group of people by using the old bad actions of one person involved, thereby painting all trans people involved as horrible and further leading to that feeling of justification in ignoring trans people.
I can't say every time because, that just wouldn't be likely. But honestly, it seems like more often than not that people with this kind of, with this who live this particular way, they always have a closet full of things. And really what they're doing is projecting, because that's what it seems like to me.
Not to mention, it also echoes and leans into the attempts to frame our recent mainstream discussion around hate targeted at Asian folks in the United States in a way that pits the Black community versus the Asian community, instead of talking about how anti-Asian sentiment is often stoked by those in power. But that's a much longer and more nuanced conversation than this video has time for, but I do wish to mention that. Additionally, though, as I said, just because one person, one leader of many who organized the walkout, said some shitty things doesn't discredit the entire group of people who are criticizing Netflix and Chappelle. Again, I'm not defending Ashley Marie Preston's tweets. They are bad. But again, we are seeing tactics being weaponized against the trans community to try to discredit and paint us all as awful simply by singular actions by one person who herself deserves a nuanced look at what she's done right and what she's done wrong just as much as Chappelle does. Because, Chappelle himself has done anti-Asian and anti-Jewish jokes and jokes about other communities that have been called out by Asian folks and Jewish folks and other folks as well. Which, by the way, it's not my place to get angry about that because I'm not a part of those communities, but neither do I think it's good that we erase the fact that he has been called out for these same things himself by those communities. So if you're going to paint Ashley Marie Preston as awful for her anti-Asian tweets, which you can, I'm not saying you shouldn't or can't, but why are you willing to do the same for Chappelle? Is it because he's just telling jokes? As I said before, while I think comedy should be provocative and gets a little bit of leeway in certain instances, you have to target those jokes in good ways and not normalize hateful speech. And this is why the argument that I kept seeing in my comments and online towards trans people about the special, that
Dave Chappelle's just a comedian, they're just jokes, get over it, you're being too sensitive.
I find that argument deeply frustrating. Being honest, I think trans people are funny. We're fucking weird. Trans people, I get it. We're weird. Dear God, just the fact that every trans woman looks like she wants to step right into Cyberpunk 2077 with all of us having half-shaved looks. Look at me. I literally look like a half-shaved cyberpunk warrior. Or the fact that every trans man looks like he wants to be a drowned Victorian boy who stepped right out of a dark academia novel. That fact is kind of hilarious. We're weird. And honestly, we'll be the first to admit that. We tend to have a good laugh at ourselves quite a bit because they kind of have to. And I also know a ton of non-transgender comedians who make really funny jokes about the trans community that aren't offensive to trans people, but do poke fun at some of the idiosyncrasies, weirdnesses, and frankly, just problems in the trans community.
And if you're transgender, you're in a rough place right now with the way laws are going on, but hey, we're all just pilots dropped into different vehicles in this world, and if you gotta work with aftermarket parts to get it to where you want it to be, you work with aftermarket parts to get it to where you want to be. Yeah.
And by the way, some of Chappelle's jokes, like this one.
A came up to me on the street the other day. He said, "Careful, Dave, they after you." I said, "What?" One they or many theys?
Are really funny. I found that joke kind of hilarious. But a lot of his jokes just feel like real-life transphobia. And that, combined with his argument that trans people are aggressive and uncaring towards him, is not only incorrect, but makes this sort of real-life transphobia justified and acceptable to people who are looking for justification to do it. And it has real-life effects, as I've stated. So yeah, I don't see it as just jokes, but something that has ramifications, and his jokes could have been done better. I'm not saying that he was actively hateful, I'm just saying he didn't do as good a job as he normally does as a comedian. Because I know he can do better, because I've seen him do better. At the end of the day, the issue here, as I almost always seem to be pointing out, is that people with the biggest platforms are not creating a conversation, they are creating a wedge. Because that's what we do in our culture war-obsessed society. And Dave Chapelle, by the way, is no means the worst offender of this, nor do I believe that it was his intention or that he had active malice towards the trans community. You may believe differently, and that's totally okay. I don't think he was trying to be actively hurtful. But in many ways, it makes it more frustrating because he keeps leaning into both overt and subtle ways of building that divide and ignoring the conversation. I want to have a conversation with Chappelle, whether it's me or someone else in the trans community. But if he doesn't want us to summon him, he doesn't get to summon us, which is what he did with the closer. If you want to have a conversation, listen to the conversation already happening first, before you start to frame trans people as the irrational ones. I don't know if Chappelle will do that, but I urge all of you who are watching this video, please listen to the actual conversation, not the white noise. And so, on that note, as I said before, I am not a monolith of the trans community. My opinion is not the opinion of every single trans person. And also, as I spoke about in my original video, there's a lot of discussion about how the conversation around Chappelle intersects with race. And so I would recommend to all of you to watch this panel that I was honored to be on Lumi Rue's wonderful Twitch channel, which featured many black trans women and other folks whose opinion I would ask you to listen to both in that panel video and elsewhere. So please check out that video.
There's this assumption about what it is to be quote unquote black, like a racialized black person and gay. And I talk a lot about media on my little corner of the internet. So whenever I think about it, I'm always fascinated by the fact that I just feel like there's a lot of invisibility when it comes to being black and queer.
I've also linked a few other videos down below that I think continue the conversation from people who are not me. I just want to say before we wrap out, I would just ask again to have you please subscribe to my channel if you haven't. And also I would say that if you like these types of deep dive analyses that I do on this channel, I also have a Patreon page that you can help support me on, and my editor and my best friend Lucian, in order to keep doing stuff, because the Patreon page helps directly pay my bills. So if you like, all the stuff that I do on this channel, including all the weird Star Trek nerdy stuff that I do on this channel, as well as discussion of trans issues, Patreon does really help me out. And also there's cool perks for you as well, like getting videos early, Star Trek Enterprise podcast that I do there, and a bunch of other stuff. So if you can support me there, I'd greatly appreciate it, but no worries if you can't. Totally understand, but greatly appreciate it if you do. But now that I've done the shill in my wares part of the video, I just want to say thank you for listening. Again, please continue the conversation. Don't shut down the conversation. For those of you who leave comments that are thoughtful and kind, I really appreciate that. And I just want to say thank you for all listening to this way too long video, but I do appreciate it, and I hope that you, as always, live long and prosper. Hey there, my patrons, I see you. Thank you for supporting me now. It's October, so I thank you so. I couldn't do this without you. It kind of sounded like Scooby-Doo, right? Anyways, here's your names, patrons. I love you so much. Jem, Shin, April Stirk, The Blessed Rain, Sarah Sweeney, Tony the Author 13, Morgan the Pirate Queen, Joe Herman Holt, Miranda Janelle, Eli Berg, Maas, Kathleen Lambeth, Ashley Allen, Bo Kiki, O.D. Cassaray, Jetty Indiana Jones, Stephen Kleinard, Alex Miller, Ish the Mad, Ramsey Thompson, Wellington Marcus, A Man Chooses, A Slave Obeys, Mary Mello Bays, Boyd Earl, April Struck, G-Man 42, Joseph Dewey, Chloe Dollar, Felicia Toast, James Crivdell, Elizabeth Christie Sen, Stephen Schuhart, Dominic Noble, Aaliyah Kai Gooch, Jessica Wright, Sonia Nero Purdue, Nathiel Fraughton, Peter Landers, Jared Johnson, Ferangato, John Steele, Wendy's the Bizzle, Celestial Dawn, Barbara Heelchuck, Geek Filter, W. Randy Edie, Piston Twisted Garage, John Witherby, Eva Kaniva, Meadow Whisperer, Melinda Walters, Ulysses the Pagan, Tiffany Danger, Casual Observer, Lysa, Alex Owen, Beatrice Purvis Flynn, Keith Briggs, Megan the Goblin, Emily Loomis, Odd Just Odd, Lamia, William Stewart, Angie Pugh, Jessica Chapman, Andrew Lama Rowe, Gretchen Badger, Amanda Ronya Adanya, Sarah Bystam, Laura Demero, Kelisis, Sky Skinner, Fritz Steven, Hieresis, Noble Munch Comics, Jacob Tovar, Nathan Steele, Mary Mack, Sarah Sweeney, Jason Knott, Sean Piper, Shib Machine Berlin, Maeve, Andrew K, Polly Mina, Strawberry Pup Tart, Lily, Rainier Amlani, Crit Fax, Nikki Gordon, Bloomfield, Chris Overbeck, Michael Hardy, Zoan Librarian, Michael Godey, Jenny Marble, Pay, Steve, Philip Hawkins, Mark Brown, Andy H, Corey, and Vale honking in. Kind of lost the Scooby-Doo of it all, but thank you so much, patrons. I love you so much, and I hope you have a wonderful Spooktober. I'm a dork.